You're listening to the Healing Mirror podcast, Non-Dual Reflections with Soraya Saraswati. Namaste, everyone. This is Soraya from the Healing Mirror podcast, and I'd like to introduce you today to a dear friend of mine, Fred Davis. Fred lives in the US in South Carolina. A hermit, he rarely travels but lives at home with his awake wife, Betsy, sharing his teaching online. His strong South Carolina accent, wacky sense of humour, and unique way of speaking to the truth may find you overlooking the amazing capacity Fred has to point to awakeness. But I assure you, Fred shares from his heart with very clear pointings. Fred calls himself a spiritual unteacher. And this is exactly what we need, to drop all the fixed patterns and the limited perceptions that hold us stuck. Fred developed the living method of awakening, which is a very clear way of pointing to awakening. And he does online sessions with that. I've known Fred and his wonderful wife, Betsy, for years now, and they've won a very special place in our hearts. We've had many enlightening conversations over the years and share an awareness that is rare among friends. One thing that's certain, when you hang out with Fred, you're going to have a good laugh. He has a unique way of turning the most serious questions you'll ever ask about the great mystery into fun. And at times a hilarious romp into non-duality. One quote I saw stated that Fred was more like a court jester than a spiritual teacher. But I assure you that Fred is the real deal.
I think I pass as a court jester too.
Yeah, you can be all of that, Fred. On a serious note, some of you may have recently seen the video, The Looking Glass, which is a brilliant piece of writing by Fred. Terry Oldfield recently put that to wonderful visuals with his brilliant musical flute improvisations. I think it'd be a wonderful thing to watch that, and everyone will enjoy that. So I'll post that on the blog below on this podcast. Fred has written a number of books available both in word and as audibles. These books include such titles as Awaken Now, The Book of Undoing, and The Book of Unknowing. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Fred Davis. Hi, Fred. Hey. Namaste.
Namaste, Soraya. It's wonderful to be with you again. And before we get started into talking about let me just tell you that I watched your interview with Sailor Bob and I just loved it. And then I watched a video with Sailor Bob and I loved that. Sailor Bob was actually a big influence on me. Been a long time since I did that kind of work, but he was a big influence on me. And one of his students was also a big influence on me, and I love and respect Bob to the end of the world.
Yeah, he's a wonderful, wonderful man, and such clarity there. It's I really, really enjoyed the interview, but we've spent a bit of time together, and it's always wonderful.
Yeah,
just like with you, Fred. It's one and the same.
Yeah, and Bob sees the humor in things as well.
Oh, he's got a really fun sense of humor too. I think I'm drawn to people who can laugh.
That's it. Yeah, because, someone told me today earlier, a client said that they had read somewhere that it's sort of like when you get it, when awakening occurs, it's like you get the punchline to a joke. And it's perfect. Isn't that it? And therefore there is laughter, right?
Well, they call it the great cosmic joke, don't they? And
it's a great cosmic joke, absolutely, right. And the great cosmic punchline is that no one tells it, no one hears it.
Actually, that's a perfect lead into something I was going to say, because when I first met you, Fred, I was curious. I'd been, through the whole ashram. I'd had a living master who had passed out of his body. I'd studied yoga and meditation for 30 years or so, and I'd been a teacher for many, many years. And I felt pretty much awake, but I felt there was a thread missing. And through our conversation, I realized, oh, I am awake. I've always been awake. Yet I didn't fully realize or recognize that.
Yes, that's it. The problem really is I think part of our problem is in the languaging itself, where we say awake and not awake. And I use those terms, so I'm not fussing at anybody, but they're red herrings. They're pointers, but they point in the wrong direction because they point toward the unit, and that there's a unit here that's awake or not awake.
Exactly. And that creates so much confusion for people, because people, they're expecting I, the separate individual self, the character, I'm going to wake up. Yeah, and I'm going to claim that awakeness.
Oh yes, I'm good, and I'm hoping it's going to show.
And
everybody will know
how awake I am. Yeah, and that's the great delusion, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's and because it's like the ego wants to say, well, gee whiz, now that I'm discovered I'm nothing, that really makes me something, doesn't it? It just wants to grab hold of anything that will aggrandize it. And the truth is that you're not awake, and anybody watching this, there's no one watching this that's awake. There's no one watching this that's not awake. There is awakeness itself, watching awakeness itself as it expresses through these two apparent bodies and the one that's watching. But there's only awakeness. So, and recognizing that there's only awakeness makes the journey toward awakeness really, really short.
Because we're already here.
We're already here, right?
The gateless gate.
That's it. It's the gateless gate, and and it's just that phrase, the gateless gate, makes no sense until awakening occurs, and
Absolutely.
It makes perfect sense the instant afterwards, right? You meant when you said surrender to this, you were actually talking about this, weren't you? I thought you were talking about some other this that was going to be here soon, and I would have a kinder, gentler arising to surrender to, and I was waiting on that.
And so, that this would be so much more whiz bang, that there's
absolutely
energy sparks flying, and
right, exactly. Angels and trumpets. And and the funny thing is that I was so far from waking up. I'd not that I hadn't tried. I was a seeker for 24 years, so I did like you. I did my duty, and I did my time. But after 24 years and I'd already had an awakening, a glimpse in 1992, but that got sucked up by ego. That was now that I've discovered I'm nothing, gee, that really makes me something. Just became an enlightened ego until even that passed. But in 2006, when the awakening occurred, I did have a pretty explosive awakening, which you don't need. And actually, I would not curse you with. I would not curse anybody with an explosive awakening, because it will bewilder and confuse you until it doesn't, which may mean for the rest of your life.
I've seen some people who have actually even ended up in psychiatric wards.
Yes, right. Well, there's I don't know I don't know the facts behind it, but I do know that I trust Adyashanti, and I remember very well him saying that he had two friends, two Zen monks who went around the U.S. and went and visited insane asylums and or mental asylums, whatever, and they came back, and their statement was that about 15% of the people in there were actually consciously awake. There was conscious awakening, but they were not functional.
No, and then sadly, they're often drugged up as well, so that there's no clarity there. There's only a
I don't think there was any talk of clarity. But that brilliant, there's that truth, and then their experience, I don't think, would be that much different from anybody else's, is that right after the blast of, or I say blast, it can be the most awake person, one of the most awake people I know, a guy that lives in the mountains of Switzerland, and a house from the 1400s, a cabin from the 1400s, and he had been a meditator for, he'd been one of the meditation schools for 30 years. And when he woke up, he looked at me and said, "You're kidding." So that was it. I mean, that was his explosive awakening, was "You're kidding." And then he said, "Of course." And he said, "Oh God, all these years." Because it feels like all of the years and all of the miles that we put in as seekers and all of this, that it was, that it feels like, oh God, I wasted all that time, but there's no waste here. There's
no time here. There's
no time. That's it. Right. Exactly. There's no waste. There's no time. So that thought, that's an egoic thought arising, saying, oh, I, Fred, the ego character, wasted all of Fred's time on, barking up the wrong trees. And that's the way you find out where it is you find out where it's not.
But Fred, I'd like your comments on this. Looking back into the history of Soraya in 1979, I had my first glimpse. And it was so powerful that my entire life changed. And I dropped my career and went, gave away everything that I owned and went to live in an ashram because I wanted to know that more, which is fascinating, because then, of course, that took me on a merry dance.
Yeah.
However, a lot of clarity, the tools that I learned through yoga and the ancient system of yoga and the pointings of the great teachers were all there, and that was all happening on a certain level.
Yes.
But there was still this idea that enlightenment would happen one day, and it would be so significant that you could not but notice it. And unrealizingly, I was, awake for many years. But when we had our conversation, and I don't know what happened, but I just went, oh, search is over. There's no more looking. There's no extra thread to find.
That's right.
It's right here, right now. And what I'd been experiencing, that expanded, wonderful feeling of perfection, was it.
Yeah. Right. And we confuse a spiritual experience with that which it accompanies, which is awakening. The spiritual experience itself is I mean, they're fun, don't get me wrong. I'd like to have one this afternoon, but I probably won't. And but the ego would love one, Fred would love one, the unit would love one. Oh, that would be great. But it's really not about that at all. That's the flash. But the truth is just so plain. Upon awakening, it really is the most obvious thing in the world. And I remember when I was a seeker, that every time I heard somebody say it's the most obvious thing in the world, it would just almost enrage me. Or you're already awake, but you don't know it yet. Either one of those things. And now I say them both, because they were both true then and they're both true now.
Mm.
There's just this awakeness, and the idea that I'm going to hit another level of awareness. This is it. See, when we say this is it, what we mean by that, mystically enough, is this is it. I mean, and it's not a pointer. It's a point, but it's not a pointer. It's just a point in a conversation where this is it. But we think that there's something else, which is what we're looking for, and that's precisely the reason that the first step on every spiritual seeker's path is a step away from the truth. Yeah. We think we're getting closer, but we don't. We think we're making progress. And I'm not saying that that there isn't value in context. There's a tremendous amount of value in context. So I'm not poo-pooing any path that anybody's on in any way. It takes what it takes until it takes. So, God bless whatever you're doing now. And if you get tired of that, there's other stuff available. Don't think that anybody that tells you that I got the one true way they are lying to you consciously or unconsciously. I think often unconsciously, but it's not true. There are no rules for you. Who would make them? Who would follow them?
There's no one there to do that.
There's no one there to do that. And it's, and how would you know that you had broken the rules when there aren't any? How do you break this? How do you do this wrong?
It's interesting though, Fred, that the one thing that is here for all of us is patterns. And I'm just using that word, pattern.
No, I'm very big on that word.
Okay, so we'll use that word, but there are many other words that could be used in its place. Mm-hmm. It could be karmic patterns, depending on what training, or what's there in your human consciousness. But if I use that word karmic patterns and look at the history, which of course is just a story of a human life, often there seems to me that completion needs to happen on certain levels before clarity can dawn completely. Certain patterns need to be really completed and then seen through for what they are. And some of those patterns then are gone. There's almost like bubbles that just pop and they're gone. But others stay, and they're patterns that can be dipped back into by the separate self. Of course, awakeness and clarity can never be influenced by that. But awakeness and clarity can come and go for a time until there is just clarity. So from the way you share with people, perhaps you can speak to that, Fred.
You bet I can. So I understand exactly what you're talking about. I see it in a different way. And the way that I see it is that it's all automated. So when we talk about karma, I just want to know whose it is. So
it comes back to that word patterns to me.
It comes back to the word patterns. So there's patterns, and they are repetitive and they are identifiable. We call that one, we have an agreement to call that one Soraya, and they'll call this one Fred.
Yeah.
It's like Hurricane Soraya or Hurricane Fred. There are these patterns of drama over here, right? Wind and rain and flood and lightning and thunder and all that. But in the center of Hurricane Fred, where you think the real essence of Fred must be, there's just an absence of storm. And so there's nothing actually in the middle. There's nothing in the middle of anything, because there is no middle to anything. Now, within relativity, we can measure 12 inches and say 6 inches is in the middle, or 100 meters and 50 meters is the middle. But the middle of what? According to who? Because what we're talking about is actually centerless living. And this centerless living, until you're accustomed to it, it can be off-putting. It can be a little scary, and this because there's no place for me to rest.
It's
And
very
that's the joy.
disorienting in the beginning for many people. They can feel very disoriented in the beginning.
Yeah. It's very disorienting. Right, exactly.
It's like, where am I? Where
That's
am
right. I got to be here somewhere, right? Because I mean, I understand that I'm nothing, but I don't understand what nothing means. Or it's the, and I don't understand the math of one either, which is that I understand there's oneness, but where is it for me, right? And there's just oneness, meaning that body has to be included within that. But that's what I always did. I always excluded the body from this body, from oneness. I could see you were part of oneness, but I couldn't, right? But there was a Fred over here that wasn't part of it, and I wanted desperately to be with, and I wanted to merge with oneness. The only problem being is there's nothing to merge with oneness. There's only oneness. So can be a sense of merging.
Yeah. Yes.
A story of merging. Yeah. And a report of merging. And we don't need to heckle that person. They're telling their experience. They're repeating memory as it's been interpreted by mind. Because my 1992 awakening, which I only saw in 2006, was absolutely on target, that it was authentic. I mean, I knew it was, but still, I had that, did I really wake up, or was I, what happened? 2006, I found out. So, but in 1992, the glimpse that I had was very short. It was the typical, well, gee whiz, there's no Fred, there's only, so there's only, but the mind quickly told the story of, it just was almost instantaneous with, oh my God, I finally got it. Fred got it. Fred, after his years and years of searching and reading and practices and everything else, Fred finally got it. And then it was like, well, damn, doesn't that makes me pretty special. And I wanted everybody to know it. And since I didn't have any physical mark, I shaved my head. But the problem, my timing was pretty bad, because instead of looking like a Zen monk, I looked more like a skinhead.
Oh, I did the orange robes, Fred.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, sure.
And the shaved head.
Yeah, right, that's it. And I did, the funny hats and all of that, which we just know is really helping us to dismantle ego, when in fact we are building just a new spiritual circle. So what I see it is not patterns that need to be completed and cleared, completed and seen through. From my standpoint is that there's all automation. And the reason I call myself an unteacher is that I'm there to interrupt those patterns. The patterns are, because there's a thing going on here, is that when you're on the seeker's wheel, you can't see the wheel. It's like being on a super highway, but there's no exit ramp, and you're just going around and around. And you're saying, "Boy, I'm really good at this, and I'm making a lot of progress at this." Sometimes we can get to the point where you go, "Gee, you know what? I think I could even teach this. It's not that hard." And but what an awakening session does, what I do is what's done here is that it's like picking the hamster up and showing it the wheel. And once you've seen the wheel, you can never completely unsee it. You can get confused, you can get miserable, you can think that you woke up and then you lost it. You can go through all of that, but there's still something embedded now that cannot be unseen. So the way I view awakening is that there is the event, which in this teaching is the interruption of the ongoing patterns. And because the pattern is what? The pattern is Fred's got to wake up. Fred's got to wake up. Because so as soon as I heard enlightenment, the next thing I knew was I wasn't. And I should be. See? And that's the thing, is that we tell ourselves, I'm not awake and I should be. But if you're, but that's actually impossible. If you should be, you would be, and you actually are anyway. So,
well, many of the greatest teachers, I mean, look at Ramana.
yeah.
He didn't ever really set out. He lay down on his in his home on the floor and thought he was dying. Yeah. And then when he got up, he was in a completely different state of consciousness. A lot of the great
interruption of that pattern.
Yeah. So everything, he did die.
Yes.
The separate self died, and he woke up when he came out of
his
that.
case it died. In my case, it took a nap.
Well, I think the nap is probably more common for it.
Yeah, I think it is too. And it's there, and there can be napping from here on out. I mean, there's no necessarily any end to it. I'm still capable of believing a thought. I'm still capable of doing anything that any other human being is capable of doing of it. So I could believe a thought. I could be cruel. It's not happening over here, but I'm just saying that there's not the rest of the human race and then the enlightened guy, right? Being the enlightened guy is seeing that equality is the rule of the day. Everything is equal. And I'm no more special than this glass. And since it's crystal, I'm not really sure that I anywhere near approach the specialness of that glass. But the clearing where we come together is you and I, is we come together on the clearing.
Exactly.
Which is, because the event may be different for everybody, because the truth is coming through a different sack of conditioning.
Yeah.
And each one of these sacks of conditioning is a snowflake. There's no two alike. So the event of awakening happens the way it happens. There are no rules for it. There's nobody got a lock on it. I don't own it. You don't own it. Nobody does. Thank God. And but once that awakening happens, regardless of what tradition you're a part of, or if you're part of no tradition, there is going to be clearing. This is actually the value. The blessing is always a curse. Being a part of a spiritual tradition can be good in the sense that when I woke up in 1992, it was just like, oh my God, right? This is so fantastic. If I had been with a Zen master at the time, he would have known, okay, that's Kensho. It's not the big one, right? It's good, that's good, but it's not. Whereas I took it all very seriously, that I had broken through to the other side. That's immediately what's happened, is that the moment that that Fredness is seen through, that there's no Fred, the moment that's seen, in comes ego in the back door, and what it goes to say is, wow, there's no Fred, isn't that something? And starts rebuilding on that.
Yeah.
That's the oscillation. There's really no oscillation. There's nowhere to go. But there's a sense of oscillation, and I had it in spades. I was miserable for years, off and on, in post-awakening, because I thought I had it, I lost it. I would get it again, I would lose it. A friend had lost his precious awakening. You just can't grasp it. From this side, you can't grasp what's going on.
Yeah. I found Fred with, I lived in the ashram and studied and taught yoga and meditation and looked at, wonderful books that are perfect pointings, like the Bhagavad Gita. And that was a great training ground for this. It was a fantastic training ground, so that however, it didn't direct me to the gateless gate.
That's right. That's right.
It was a great undoing of patterns and a seeing through of patterns, but it didn't show me it's here right now. And the spiritual experiences I had, which became stories, were awakenings, but that awakening didn't remain because I thought it was something else, that there was something else we had to achieve. It must be greater than that. So everything you've just said is exactly what I experienced myself. Well, Soraya experienced that.
Yeah, you're right. I get it. No.
The true self didn't experience that because it's free. However, I think it's the story of so many people. So it's very important that, this becomes very clear that the patterns and the clarity and continuing to see through the patterns and allow clarity to really land here is important. But actually, the awakening can happen in an instant because it's as soon as the veil drops.
That's it. Yeah.
And any sense of claiming that from the separate self drops, we're there.
Once you've seen that the Wizard of Oz is this tall, right? That he's behind a curtain and he's got a machine. You don't have to see that for a long time to get it, right? And that's basically what happens here too. So it's a glimpse will do it. But like in 1992, had I understood had there been any understanding whatsoever other than egoic of what had just occurred, then it would have been a whole different story, which it couldn't have been because it could only be the way it is. But that's the feel of it, is that something, if there'd have been a teacher there to point me, but I was, I didn't know any, only thing I had done, I was associated with Tibetan tradition, and they wouldn't let me be the Dalai Lama, and I dropped out of that. And so, and I went and tried to work with the Zen people, and they wouldn't let me be the master. So I left that. And I was never a joiner. So I never had, and there wasn't, I don't know that there was or was not, there was no internet. So I don't know what was actually available, but I can tell you that in Columbia, South Carolina, it was damn little.
I have to say, in the Northern Territory, in Arnhem Land, it was pretty low too. Yeah. The only thing I got a letter in the mail about this ashram because I'd been looking into yoga, and so I followed that. That was the only thread there, and obviously that was exactly how it was meant to be.
Oh, that's it. You can. I mean, I don't know what we were laughing with Terry before we started the interview, which is that I can report very clearly on what this thing has just finished doing, and I can see that it was done just right. But I cannot predict at all what this thing is fixing to do because I don't know, and I don't make those decisions. That's not my department.
No, we're being lived. We laughed about that because Terry had no idea that he was going to make the film for your
right. That's it. Yeah.
And I had no idea this year that I was going to start a podcast. There was a vague hint of it, but I had no idea how to, get my head around the logistics of that. But it seems to have happened. Here we are.
It just happens, and the coolest things really happen in our absence. When Fred and Soraya are not there, that's when awakening occurs. And that's when clearing occurs, because it feels like, well, Fred and Soraya are just getting clearer and clearer, and isn't this great? But the fact is there is no Fred and there is no Soraya, so that can't be happening. And what's happening when it feels like I have just, whatever that I is, when it feels like I have just had, the character thinks it's just had a big spiritual experience. What's actually happened, instead of Fred having a big spiritual experience, is that awakeness has just had a Fred-free moment. And right? And that Fred-free moment, that's the truth. That's awakeness. So but it feels exactly the opposite. That's another reason that we get caught in this sense of oscillation, because it feels like, oh, I'm making a breakthrough. I'm really making progress now. I'm starting to understand this, and God forbid, I don't understand what we're talking about, and don't want to understand what we're talking about. Yeah.
I think that's why it's called the backward teaching sometimes. Backwards teaching.
Yeah.
You know, things are the reverse of how we think they are.
That's exactly it. That's that. And it starts right at the beginning, which is with the most obvious thing, which is that Fred and Soraya wanted to wake up to the truth of God, and God woke up to the fiction of Fred and Soraya instead.
Yeah.
And so it starts out backwards and it stays backwards. And as far as I can tell, it never changes that. Because every big spiritual breakthrough, maybe the little ones I can't really say, but every big spiritual breakthrough that I've ever had, it was seeing that something worked backwards from the way that I thought. And it's the reason that we got millions of seekers out there that cannot wake up, and that will, you know, in all likelihood will never wake up. If historically we'd had tens of millions, I don't know how many, of seekers, and what percentage of them actually woke up? Oh my God. I mean, it's this tiny, tiny, tiny little thing. And now I think that the numbers are still very small, but I think the percentages are higher. And I give a lot of credence of that to the internet.
I agree, actually. Even things like this podcast now.
Yeah.
And, you know, you run an online satsang as well. And
Yeah.
I'm now running an online satsang so that we can actually talk, share, and support each other in clearing and maintaining that clarity, and lovingly point out when we slip back in the doo-doo of Fred and Soraya.
Yeah, that's it. So it's YouTube is what's made this thing sort of well known within non-duality, you know.
And you've got some great YouTube clips, and I recommend people to have a look at Fred's YouTube channel, because it will keep you entertained and also keep pointing you back to what you really aren't.
It's going back and back and back, because there is a sense that, oh, well, Fred, I've heard all this. Can we get on with the important part? And part. And I have people that in awakening sessions, I can see that there's ego, lots of ego present. And I bow and kowtow to the ego. That's what I do. And because I can't afford to let the ego go against me. But the ego, it's the getting rid of the ego is not what we're after. It's because we don't need to, and the getting rid of thought is not what we're after. Thought is not our enemy. The ego is not our enemy. I can't find an ego to have as an enemy, right? Just as Ramana said, you know, what you use the ego to pursue the ego, and then both will disappear.
Use the mind to jump over the mind.
Yes, that's it. And we use this body also to go beyond the body. And in this teaching, I use a lot of logic. I use a lot of what you could call Western philosophy. And but I use a lot of logic to take us beyond logic. You can't get this from logic. You can infer it with logic. You certainly can. And
you can point to it.
You can get right to it, but the actual seeing, there's nothing logical about it, because it's exactly backwards or the way it's taught. And so, but the thing is, as you know, is that we want to do is we want to claim the event. And I am, you know, which is, wow, I woke up yesterday and that was just terrific. Let me tell you about it. You have to be awake to this arising. There is no sense whatsoever. I know that people look at it and think differently, but there's no awakened Fred Davis. And there's no sense of permanent, I mean, I must say, there's no sense of permanent enlightenment over here because there's no one to be permanently enlightened. There is, whatever that is, am awake to this moment, which means in an online chat room with Soraya and dogs and this and that I with all of that I can to overcome. I still know who and what I am. That's all right now.
Yeah.
And it's and that knowing that we're speaking of is of a different order than book knowing.
I think a way I always remind myself of that is awakeness can only be in the present moment. We can't have awakeness in the past or in the future. It can only be here, right now, with whatever's happening. It can't be anywhere else.
That's right. That's right. Because
Fred,
there's not anything else.
No.
And
I've got one last question for you, Fred.
Go ahead.
You've also written a book called Beyond Recovery, Non-duality and the 12 Steps.
Right.
I think this is a really important book, and I also know that you run a program on that as well. Can you speak a little bit about that and how that came about, Fred?
So I don't have an ongoing active program. I do have there is a video course on Beyond Recovery. And, but I just, the only reason I don't is because I haven't up to now. But I came to non-duality by way of 12-step recovery. And in 12-step recovery, there is a surrender, and there is a spiritual awakening as promised. It's just not this one, but it's that there's still a spiritual awakening. And the way I look at it doesn't mean that you can't wake up from the 12 steps. I know for a fact that you can. Not that I did, but I do know of people who have. And so you can, but the problem is that most of the time, 12-step recovery will actually, they end up, it kind of gets a focusing of the focus goes to, let me get my stuff back. Let me get my life back. Let me get things in order, which is perfectly, there's a role for that. And AA saved my life. So I got nothing but good things to say about it. Saved my wife's life. So neither one of us have anything to say about it. Nonetheless, I used to live beside a guy who was a counselor, a drug counselor for alcohol abuse counselor for 25 years. And he used to tell me, he and I used to talk about it. And he said that it used to be that at about 5 years that people in 12-step recovery would hit a plateau. And that plateau is a very dangerous place because you've come through all the spiritual wang bang and you've gotten all your stuff together. And then there's a what next? And it's like, well, just take the first step again. And that works for some people, and that's wonderful. I have no objections.
Would you say your program is something that can take people on from that point?
That's it. It's beyond, it is literally, it's beyond recovery. It uses the 12 steps. Well, I mean, it doesn't really use the 12 steps. What I do is I divided the book into 12 chapters, each chapter representing a step, and I look at that step from a non-dual perspective.
Perfect.
And so that a new clarity can dawn, and a new spiritual awakening can occur. And there are people who, I don't run the program, but there are people, I get emails that in little circles here and there, and I mean, I know that even in South Africa and in Australia, there are groups who use Beyond Recovery as a text, and that they're not 12-step groups. They're meetings after the meetings, and they study these principles. but they study them from a non-dual perspective, and it can be life-changing.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I just love that. I know how much, AA and the 12-step program has helped so many people, but
Yeah.
and bringing some sort of spiritual awareness that perhaps wouldn't
have come.
No,
I wouldn't be here today.
No.
What I'm saying.
Then, as you say, what then? What?
Yes, because it can feel, it did here. It can feel a bit circular.
Yeah.
And this.
So that can become another pattern.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And then that pattern
you don't have to be present for that pattern to run. Yeah. And that pattern can go to meetings, and that patterns can do the steps, and there's all this automated stuff that's happening, and there's no conscious presence there.
Yeah.
What this does is that because on this thing that you and I are talking about, whatever it is, there's certainly no plateau on this. I mean, there. If you think you're plateauing, you've missed it. You've already backed out of it. Like I've gotten this far, but not much has happened. It's an ego talking, right? That's an ego talking. Which means that you're no longer consciously awake at this moment. Could have had the best awakening ever, right? I made a movie about it. Who cares? Are you awake to this arising?
Yeah. And this arising is all there is.
And this arising is all there is.
Yeah. This is it.
Yeah, this is it. And this is and now is the only time to wake up. There's no waking up soon. There's no waking up later. There's no waking up after I go to this event or talk to that teacher or read that book. We wake up now or never. We wake up here or nowhere. Yeah. It's
interesting, isn't it, Fred? Because it's a bit like letting go of an addiction. It's like, this is my last pack of cigarettes, or this is, next week is it. I'm just going to drink this week, but next week,
seeking is an addiction, because it's the same addiction as alcohol, really, because or drugs, or gambling, or sex, or anything else I've been addicted to, is that because the addiction really is to more.
Yeah.
I just want more, and I see that this is it, but it's just not enough. That's not awakeness speaking, right? That's you moved back into an egoic position when you're seeing that. So the idea is, that's the reason that I talk about being an unteacher in the book of undoing and unknowing and unveiling, is that we already know way enough. If we finished our first book or two of non-duality, we already know enough, maybe even too much already. So we have to come to unknow what we
think we know.
We have to come to unknow what we think we know, and because there's a false reference, which is where this character is going to wake up. Well, which character is that, right? I mean, the big philosophical argument is, do we have free will or not? My question is, who the hell are they talking
about? It's interesting, isn't it, though? We live in a society now where it's really all about building the self up, your online profile, and I had this little thing happen recently where on my Facebook page it had Soraya Saraswati, spiritual teacher, and every time I looked at it I cringed, because I felt like there was a box there, and I didn't have the techie knowledge to get rid of the spiritual teacher bit.
Right.
But yesterday I made a concerted effort and found that it was easier to do on my iPhone than it was on the computer, and I achieved it. That was
that's wonderful.
I jumped out of the box, and although you may be called a spiritual teacher, but to label ourselves, to label the separate self, and then to put the separate self forward as that label can it's almost like a dog to a bone to a dog. You know, we're calling our ego back in all the time, and it's a tricky thing, particularly when consciousness is obviously using these vehicles to do what it's doing through them, which is this work.
Yes, that's right.
And then on a certain level, you know, there's someone searching on the internet for something. We need to have those key words out there. So it's finding that balance, but not being attached to it, and not putting ourselves, or not identifying with the separate self in that box. And that's why I like the whole idea of keeping it light. And it's a big game, and you know, there's nothing wrong with any of it, really.
90% of the people who wake up with me wake up laughing,
which is wonderful.
That's true. Yeah, it's great. It's great. And I'll tell them that, but they still don't see it coming. And you know, I tell them that at the beginning. Well, likelihood you're going to laugh, but because let me tell you something. If you do not have a sense of humor, this is going to be much more difficult, right? It's going to, I mean, geometrically more difficult. Because we're trying to relax our way into truth. And that's how you get it, is you get it not by relaxing, not by tensing, but by relaxing.
Absolutely.
But when I've got somebody that's real serious, I'm trying to tense my way into relaxation.
It's a very stiff way of living, isn't it? When we're stuck in the intellect.
And so I usually can win, these days, I can typically win even them over, but it's much harder on both of us because there's so much that has to be unlearned, because there's a belief there's a strong belief in other. Right? There's a strong belief in other. There's a strong belief in more. There's a strong belief in lighter. And none of these things are true. And the character will never come to see that. Soraya will never understand this. Fred will never understand this. There is no awake Fred Davis anywhere. This unit is not awake. This unit is awakeness, but it's not awake.
Yeah. Yet we loosely use those terms because we are limited by language, you know, and
I still use them.
I was writing the blog after I'd done a podcast with Sailor Bob, and everything I wrote, I thought, but you can analyze things to death sometimes, because I was so limited by the language, and I could see that certain language can be misconstrued because the ego will grab hold of that
and
make of it what it will.
All language can be misconstrued. I can't actually tell you the truth during this interview. What I can do is I can tell you the truth plus the Fred spin. But there's, right? Don't think there's not any.
I'm going to use that, Fred. I've got a Soraya spin.
Yeah, that's it. And that's it, because the truth comes in, let's just say it comes in through this filter, and it comes in 100%, and it hits this filter, and there's still enough Fredness here, enough belief, and this, that, and the other, that it comes out 85%. And the very next thing that it hits is the Soraya spin, and it gets reduced further, so that I'm lucky if 50% of what I say actually gets to, quote, me over there. Yes, not that there's an over there, not that there's a me over there, but there's a sense of it.
Yeah.
So that's the reason that I've hearkened back to my favorite saying, which is that repetition is the mother of clarity. Yeah. Pound, 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 pound. Boom, boom. I am a hammer, and I see every problem as a nail, because every single problem that anybody has ever come to me with that was not a practical problem. Well, even then, even from that an angle on that too, it's always misidentification. And as a client told me recently, I don't want to take credit for it yet. Eventually, I will. But as a client told me recently, identification is misidentification.
Very good.
Yes, isn't that great? Yes.
Yeah. And you and I are quite blessed, really, because we have partners, which is, to me, like looking in the healing mirror. You know, we're looking at ourselves and our partners all the time, and we happen to have awake partners, which is such a blessing, because we have
huge.
this wonderful, you know, reflection going on to support the annihilation of the separate self.
It's huge. It's huge. The and the people that I know that are couples who are awake, it's a blessing beyond measure. And
it is indeed.
It is something that can happen. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it can happen in any marriage, because you just can't. We have to surrender to the inevitable. We can't predict it.
No, we can't. There just needs to be a willingness and an openness. And then if you know, if consciousness, the universe, God, love wants that to happen.
And the willingness doesn't come from the person either. That also comes from is the circumstance.
True.
And I say this because I mean a big part of my practice now, really, it is I have awakening sessions and then clarity sessions, but awakening sessions with people who are with awakened beings, where the awakening's taken place, but there's just no clarity, and because there's no context. We were talking about the value of context, the value of spiritual reading and training and stuff like that. It won't get you to enlightenment, and it can stand in the way. But if you actually do, if awakening occurs, you'll find it all to be very, very valuable. And it's got to occur. That's clearing. You can do some clearing prior to awakening. But the really important clearing you can't do until awakening is already present. Conscious awakeness is already present.
I think that preparation can be important, though, that preparation, which sometimes involves the dark night of the soul, where someone has to reach a point where there's no other way to go on as the ego self. Or it can simply be a preparation through relaxation and letting go of the intellectual grip on the way we think things should be. But that's different in every circumstance, and we can never know, can we?
No, we can't. There's no way. It's what we find is that we come to unknow more and more. But it's like Socrates, who's my hero, that when approached by the people of Athens, and they said, Socrates, we have heard that you are the wisest man in Athens. Is that true? And Socrates was taken aback, and he said just this: Socrates is the wisest man in Athens? How could that be? Because Socrates doesn't know anything, and all of you know so much. And that's the truth, isn't it? So it's coming to unlearn what it really is. It's the book of undoing, or book of unknowing. It's the unknowing. It's the undoing, the unveiling, and because we're all coming to this process in order to add something, and awakening is actually a process of subtraction. So that's another backwards part.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I'm never happier than just sitting under a tree weeding, or sitting in the garden looking at flowers or insects or birds. Mm-hmm. And in that, doing nothing is needed.
Yeah, I mean, I could sit in my living room all day, not reading. I'm just sitting in there and just there's no sense of boredom, right? Because boredom is the idea that there should be something going on other than this. And I really, right?
Yeah.
And you said, well, that's ridiculous.
Well, that's resistance to presence, isn't it?
Yeah. So fortunately, I had Betsy to come in and prod me and tell me what you wanted to do. You have an hour in between sessions. What did you want to accomplish today? Well, I wanted to work on the book, and I wanted to work out. We'll get started on one of them.
That's great. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Yeah,
Fred.
it's terrific. Yeah, it's great to see you again. It's great to be in your company. And Betsy and I send both of you and Terry big, and all of the rest of you out there too. Big love.
Yeah. It's been lovely to interview you today, Fred, and just have some time together, because it's we've been emailing each other, but we haven't been face to face for a little while. So it's
no, we haven't, and it's and I've missed you, and I've missed Terry, and it is tremendous experience to be here, and I want to thank you both for being my friends and being in my life, and it means a great deal to you, and I love your music.
Thank you, Fred. You know, you live in our hearts as well, and Betsy, and God willing, the bodies will meet one day, but if not, it doesn't matter, because you're there, I'm here, and it's all one thing going on.
It's just one thing going on, no matter, there's no such thing as distance. There's a sense of distance, but there's no actual distance.
Okay, namaste.
Namaste.
Join me for upcoming podcasts. And please, if you found this helpful, or you'd like to share a comment, or perhaps your own experience, I'd love for you to leave that message down below this podcast. I enjoy reading your feedback, and I'm sure we can all help each other to hold hands, to remain awake, present, clear, and loving. Namaste.